The certified letter arrived on a Tuesday. Raina Keller read it standing in the doorway of the duplex she'd lived in for 8 years, her 11-year-old son Milo sitting on the stairs behind her with his backpack already between his feet, watching her face the way children watch their mothers when they know something is wrong but haven't been told what. She read the letter once, folded it, put it in her back pocket, didn't cry, didn't reach for the phone, didn't sit down. She did math. The letter was from a law firm she'd never heard of, Whitaker, Dane and Associates, written on behalf of the Keller Family Trust. It informed her that the duplex at 19 Birch Hollow Road, Briarton, West Virginia, was and had always been the property of said trust, administered by trustees Dale and Verna Keller. That her late husband, Jesse Keller, had been a permitted occupant, but had never held title, equity, or transferable interest in the property. That the trustees had elected to restructure the trust's real property holdings, effective immediately. That Raina had 30 days to vacate. 30 days. After 8 years of mortgage payments, she now realized went into someone else's account. After replacing the roof, fixing the plumbing, painting every room with her own hands while Jesse worked doubles at the rail yard. After raising Milo in a house she'd treated as hers because nobody had ever told her it wasn't. 30 days to become nobody, living nowhere, with nothing. Milo spoke from the stairs. "Mom, what's that letter about?" "Change of plans," Raina said. Her voice was level, flat as a surveyor's line. "Start thinking about what fits in the car." Jesse had been dead for 6 weeks. Late winter car accident on Route 47, black ice, guardrail, the kind of phone call that turns an ordinary Thursday into the last day of one life and the first day of something worse. He'd been a good man in the ways that don't show up on legal documents. He loved Raina. He loved Milo. He worked hard and came home tired and never raised his voice. But Jesse Keller had also never put Raina's name on anything. Not the house, not the bank accounts, not the truck. His parents had always handled the business side, and Jesse, who avoided conflict from the same people the way water avoids high ground, had let them. "It's just easier this way, Ray. You know how my mom gets." She knew how his mom got. Verna Keller got what she wanted always. Be through paperwork and patience and the particular cruelty of people who never raise their voices because they never need to. Dale was the signature. Verna was the strategy. Together, they ran their family the way mid-level executives run failing departments, by controlling information and pretending it was protection. At the funeral, they'd been polite, careful. They positioned themselves at the front of the church and let Rana stand to the side the way you make room for a temporary employee at a company meeting. Verna touched Raina's arm once, a gesture that managed to communicate both condolence and dismissal in a single motion. "You'll be taken care of," Verna had said. "We're family." The eviction letter arrived 11 days later. Raina didn't waste time being angry. Anger was a luxury for people who could afford to sit still. She had $347 in checking, a part-time night shift stacking inventory at a discount store that paid $11.50 an hour, an aging Honda Civic with 180,000 miles, and a check engine light that had been on so long she'd stopped seeing it. And Milo. Always Milo. She opened her laptop that night at 2 a.m. while Milo slept. The kitchen table was covered in bills she was rearranging by urgency. A game of financial triage she'd been playing since the funeral. But tonight, she wasn't looking at bills. She was looking at options, rental listings she couldn't afford, shelter programs with waiting lists measured in months, credit applications that would be denied before the ink dried. And then, almost accidentally, she found the county auction page. Most of the listings were what you'd expect: scrapland, storage units, the tax-delinquent lots that nobody wanted, because wanting them cost more than they were worth. But one listing, buried near the bottom of the page, had been sitting there for 3 weeks with 0 bids. Abandoned mountain cabin, no utilities, rumored haunted, minimum bid $300. The photographs were terrible, grainy, poorly lit, taken by someone who clearly wanted to discourage interest rather than attract it. Dark wood, crooked door, vines crawling the porch posts. One side of the chimney collapsed. The kind of property that real estate agents describe as character rich when they're trying not to say condemned. Every other listing on the page had competition. This one sat alone, like a chair nobody would take at a dinner party. Raina stared at the screen. She stared at the photographs. Yes, she stared at the number. $300, and she ran the math again, the way she always ran math, not with hope, but with precision. $300 would empty her account. $300 would leave nothing for gas, groceries, or emergencies. $300 was irresponsible, reckless, and possibly the dumbest financial decision a broke single mother could make. $300 was also the exact price of owning something that nobody could take away from her with a certified letter. Most people, when they lose the ground under their feet, reach for the nearest person. Raina reached for information. Because information is the only currency that doesn't need someone else's permission to spend. She clicked on the listing. Read every word. Read it again. And somewhere between the second reading and the third, but between the description of structural damage and the disclaimer about as-is condition, Raina Keller stopped being a woman who was losing her home and became a woman who was acquiring one. The distinction was everything. Because in a country where paperwork decides who gets to stay and who has to leave, the person holding the deed is the person who writes the rules. Raina didn't see a haunted cabin. She saw something far more valuable, a property nobody else wanted. And in her experience, the things nobody wants are usually the things nobody has bothered to understand. The county records office smelled like old paper and floor wax, the kind of government building that hadn't been renovated since the decade it was built, and had settled into its own obsolescence like a man who stops buying new clothes after retirement. Daharbi. Raina arrived at 8:47 a.m., 13 minutes before opening, and waited on the bench outside the door with a notebook in her lap and a list of questions she'd written at 4 a.m. She wasn't going to buy a haunted cabin on a photograph and a prayer. She was going to buy it on data. The clerk who processed her research request was a woman named Cora Phelps, 68 years old, retired from the county's deed office, but still volunteering 3 days a week. Because, as she told anyone who'd listen, somebody has to know where the bodies are buried in these filing cabinets. Cora wore reading glasses on a beaded chain and had the steady, measuring eyes of a woman who'd spent 40 years watching people lie about property values. Raina asked for the deed history on Parcel 77B, Section 14, the listing she'd found the night before. Cora pulled the file without comment, but when she opened it and saw the address, her fingers paused on the paper. "The old Harrow place," Cora said, not a question. "You know it?" "I know everyone in this county has an opinion about it, and nobody has the facts." Cora set the file on the counter between them. "You sure about this one, honey?" She wasn't being dismissive. She was being curious, the way a woman gets curious when she's heard a name she hasn't thought about in years and suddenly remembers why it made her pay attention the first time. Raina read the file. The cabin was built in 1947 by a man named Eldon Harrow, a coal miner who worked the surrounding hills for the Briarton Mining Company until the main shaft closed in 1965. He'd purchased the land with cash, built the cabin himself. Naaman lived there alone until his death in 1971 at age 63. No spouse, no children, no recorded heirs. The property had passed to the county, where it sat in legal limbo for decades, too remote to develop, too decayed to rent, too haunted to attract buyers. The haunting was the part everyone remembered and nobody could verify. Teenagers had been daring each other to visit the Harrow place for generations. A county caretaker in the 1990s had found carvings on the interior walls, strange symbols, circles, arrows, numbers scratched into the wood, and had quit the same week, telling anyone who'd listen that the place talked to him at night. Someone else claimed they'd heard whispers near the basement entrance. A local pastor had offered to bless the property in 2003 and reportedly left after 20 minutes, saying only that some places hold things that blessing doesn't fix. No police reports, no missing persons, no documented incidents of any kind, just stories told by people who'd never actually stepped inside and repeated by people who never intended to. Most people heard haunted and backed away. Raina heard two words that mattered more: No competition. She placed the bid online that afternoon from the parking lot of the discount store before her shift started. $300 plus $47 in county fees and processing. Her checking account dropped to zero. Her savings account had been at zero since Jesse's funeral expenses. She was now technically poorer than she'd been at any point in her adult life. But she was also, for the first time, an owner. Raina understood something about paperwork that most people learn too late. In America, the distance between invisible and visible is usually one document, one signature, one filed deed that changes the calculation. She'd just gone from a guest in someone else's house, a permitted occupant, as the eviction letter had so carefully phrased it, to the legal owner of a piece of land, a physical asset, however ruined, a fixed address, however remote, a piece of paper that said she existed in the only language that courts and schools and custody evaluations recognize. The language of property. She didn't tell Verna and Dale. She let them believe she was struggling. Let them nod with manufactured concern at the grocery store when they crossed paths. Let Verna say, "We're praying for you, Raina," in a tone that sounded less like prayer and more like a countdown. Raina nodded back and said thank you, and kept her face as blank as a deed nobody had read yet. Authority isn't always loud. Sometimes authority is the woman who says nothing while she signs a document that changes the entire equation. On her last night in the duplex, Raina was packing dishes in the kitchen when she heard Verna's voice through the thin wall of the adjoining unit. Verna was on the phone with Dale, speakerphone, the volume up because Dale's hearing had been going for years, and they were talking about Raina the way people talk about problems they've already solved. "She'll be in a shelter within the month," Verna said, her voice carrying the flat confidence of a woman who'd done this kind of math before. "Then we can talk to the family court about custody. A mother with no fixed address isn't a mother, Dale. She's a liability." Custody. They weren't just taking her house, they were building a case to take her son. The eviction wasn't the end of their plan, it was the beginning. Drive Raina out, let her fail, let her become exactly the kind of unstable they needed her to be on paper. And then step in as the responsible, established, financially secure grandparents who could provide what she couldn't. Raina set the dish she was holding on the counter very carefully, the way you set something down when your hands want to throw it. Her breathing was even, her jaw was tight, and somewhere behind her eyes a calculation finished running, the kind of math that doesn't show on paper but changes the outcome of everything that comes after. She would not be in a shelter. She would not be a liability. Dar and Verna Keller had just made the one mistake that careful people should never make. She'd said her strategy out loud where someone quiet was listening. If this story is already making your blood run hot, if you've ever had someone try to take what was yours while smiling to your face, stay right here, because what Raina finds next in that cabin will change everything, and I need you here for it. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss a single chapter of this story. And hi, viewers, I want to ask you something real quick. Have you ever been underestimated by someone who thought they were smarter than you? Just one word, yes or no. Drop it in the comments right now. Because Raina's about to prove what happens when the quiet ones stop being quiet. The cabin looked worse in person. Raina had expected that. What she hadn't expected was the silence. Not empty silence, but weighted silence. The kind that presses against your eardrums like altitude change, like the air itself had been sitting still for so long it had forgotten how to move. She parked the Civic at the bottom of the access road because the ruts were too deep for a sedan and carried the first load of supplies up the hill on foot. A camping lantern, sleeping bags, a cooler of food, Milo's school backpack, and a toolbox she'd bought at a yard sale 3 years ago and never used. Milo walked beside her, his eyes moving the way they always moved, catching details, filing them, asking questions later. He was 11, but he carried himself like a kid who'd been promoted past his grade level by circumstances rather than choice. His father's death had aged him in ways that wouldn't show on a growth chart. He looked at the cabin for a long time before speaking. "Mom, are we really going to live here?" The building leaned slightly to the east, as if the hill itself had been pushing against it for decades, and the cabin had decided to compromise rather than fight. Dark wood planks, hand-cut and thick, covered in a skin of gray weathering. The porch sagged in the middle where a support beam had rotted through. The front door hung crooked in its frame. One side of the stone chimney had collapsed outward, scattering fieldstone across the overgrown yard. Vines crawled the porch posts like they had been claiming the place for years and resented the interruption. "We're going to make this place listen to us," Raina told him. "Not the other way around." She pushed the door open. The hinges screamed. Inside, stale air, heavy, cold, smelling of must and rotting wood and something mineral beneath it, like wet rock. Dust thick enough to write and covered every surface. In the far corner, a pile of ruined furniture slumped like shapes that had given up trying to be useful. A kitchen counter of warped wood, a sink with no faucet, a wood stove that looked functional but hadn't been lit in 30 years. But Raina wasn't looking at what was broken. She was looking at what was built. Beneath the decay, the structure was serious. The beams overhead were hand-hewn from hardwood, oak or chestnut, massive and square, joined with mortise and tenon joints that had held for nearly 80 years without shifting. The walls were double-planked, like insulated with something she couldn't identify from the inside, but that spoke to a builder who understood cold winters. The floor joists were tight and level, despite decades of neglect. Whoever put this cabin together wasn't throwing up shelter. They were engineering permanence. Then she saw the kitchen wall. Floor to ceiling, carved directly into the wood, were rows of symbols, not scratched randomly like graffiti, carved with precision, clean lines, consistent depth, evenly spaced, circles with lines through them, arrows pointing in specific directions, numbers crossed with diagonal marks, small squares containing dots arranged in patterns that repeated at regular intervals. Milo stepped closer. "That's creepy." "That's information," Raina said. She pulled out her phone and took photographs, 17 photographs moving left to right, documenting every symbol on the wall. She would study them later. Right now, she needed to make this place survivable before dark. They swept the main room, cleared debris, tested the wood stove. The flue was blocked, but Raina climbed onto the remaining chimney section and cleared enough to establish draft. By nightfall, they had a fire, the camping lantern, and sleeping bags laid out in the back of the Civic parked beside the cabin's porch. The cabin itself needed too much work to sleep in safely. She'd clear and stabilize the main room over the coming days, but having the car next to the building, with the fire visible through the open cabin door, was enough for tonight. Milo fell asleep first. He always did. His body choosing unconsciousness over anxiety the way children's bodies protect them from things their minds can't yet process. Raina didn't sleep. She sat in the driver's seat with the lantern on the dashboard and studied the photographs of the wall carvings on her phone, zooming in, scrolling, comparing. The symbols weren't random. She could see that already. The numbers repeated in sequences. The arrows had consistent orientation relative to structural features, a window, a door frame, the position of the wood stove. The circles aligned with specific points in the wood, knots, nail heads, joint markers. Someone had carved a system into this wall. Not art, not madness, not ghosts, a system. The question was, a system of what? At 3 a.m. Moonlight shifted through the cabin's kitchen window and hit the carved wall at an angle the daylight hadn't provided. The symbols cast shadows against each other, and in those shadows, Raina saw something that made her sit up straight in the car seat. The shadow lines converged. They formed a directional pattern, an arrow made not by any single carving, but by the combined shadows of dozens of them, all pointing in the same direction, toward the back room, the one room she hadn't entered yet, the one with the door that was closed when every other door in the cabin hung open. Fear is a reaction. Strategy is a decision. And the difference between the woman who runs and the woman who wins is usually which one she chooses first. Raina looked at the closed door through the cabin's kitchen window. She looked at Milo asleep beside her. She looked at the carvings throwing their shadow arrow across the moonlit wall. She would open that door tomorrow, and what she'd find inside, or more precisely what Milo would find, would begin unraveling a 60-year-old secret that 3 generations of people had been too afraid to look at directly. The haunting of the Harrow cabin was never ghosts. It was geometry. And the man who built these walls had carved directions into them for someone smart enough to read the language. Raina was beginning to think she might be that someone. The county records office had become Raina's second workplace. Every morning after dropping Milo at Briarton Elementary, she'd enrolled him the day after they arrived because a child in school is a child with a stable address. And a stable address is armor in a custody fight. She drove to the gray cinder block building on Maple Street and pulled files until her shift started at the discount store. She wasn't studying the carvings with her hands anymore. She was studying them with maps. On the third visit, she found it. A survey map from 1953, hand-drawn, filed with the county assessor's office by the West Virginia Bureau of Mines. Her parcel, the Harrow property, overlapped with an older designation marked in faded red ink. A mining claim, filed in 1948 by Eldon Harrow, 1 year after he built the cabin. The claim was small, a wedge of subsurface rights pressed into the hillside, barely 47 acres. But its coordinates intersected almost precisely with the cabin's footprint. Raina spread her notebook beside the map and compared. The numbers from the wall carvings, the ones she'd been treating as an abstract code, matched the coordinate notations on the mining claim. Not approximately, exactly. The circles on the wall corresponded to survey markers. The arrows indicated directional bearings. The crossed numbers were elevation references. Eldon Harrow hadn't vandalized his own walls. He'd turned his cabin into a map, a coded, three-dimensional architectural map that tied the building itself to the mineral rights beneath it. Every carving was a data point. Every symbol was a reference to the claim filed 11 months after the last nail went in. The man had built a house and then carved its purpose into its bones, hiding the information in plain sight because he knew or feared that paper records could be lost, stolen, or conveniently misplaced by the same mining companies that had employed him. But the claim had never been developed. Eldon died in 1971. No heirs, no one to read what he'd written. The county filed the property into its auction backlog and the mining claim into its abandoned records. And the two pieces of paper that together told a complete story were separated into different cabinets in different offices and never reconnected. Until now. Raina made copies of everything: the original survey map, the mining claim filing, her own photographs of the wall carvings with annotations showing the coordinate matches. She stored one set in the toolbox in her car trunk and mailed a second set to a P.O. box she'd rented for $15 a month at the Briarton post office. Redundancy. Because information that exists in only one place is information that can be destroyed. That afternoon, while she was clearing brush from the cabin's access road to make it passable for the Civic, a pickup truck stopped at the bottom of the hill. Clean. Late model. The kind of truck that costs more than the cabin and the land it sat on combined. The man who stepped out was mid-40s, clean-shaven, wearing a canvas jacket that looked expensive, but was designed to look working class. The costume of someone who wanted to be trusted by people who actually wore canvas to work. He climbed the hill with an easy smile and a handshake already extended before he was within 10 feet. "Boyd Harmon," he said, "Ridgepoint Holdings. We're a regional development company. We work with property owners in the area on land management, conservation, that sort of thing." He looked at the cabin the way a buyer looks at something he's already decided to purchase. "Heard someone finally picked this place up. Wanted to introduce myself. See if you'd be interested in talking about options." "Options," Raina repeated. "We acquire properties in the area for conservation and development purposes. I'd be happy to take this off your hands, save you the headache of renovation. $5,000, cash, quick closing, generous for a place with no utilities and a reputation." He smiled. Fair offer for a fresh start. $5,000 for a property she'd paid $300 for. Oh, a 1,600% return on investment. Any financial advisor would call that a win. But financial advisors don't usually show up on dirt roads and expensive trucks within 2 weeks of a $300 auction purchase. And they don't drive directly to a cabin that's been sitting untouched for decades, as if they had the GPS coordinates memorized. Boyd Harmon hadn't come to help her. He'd come because she'd bought something he wanted, and he'd come fast, faster than casual interest would justify, which meant he'd been watching that auction listing, waiting for it. And when someone else bid first, he'd come to assess whether the buyer was the kind of person who would take a quick profit and walk away. When someone offers you money for something they call worthless, they're telling you two things. First, that it isn't worthless, and second, that they're hoping you don't know that yet. "I appreciate the offer, Mr. Harmon," Raina said, "but I'm going to hold on to it for now." His smile didn't change, but his eyes did. A flicker, brief, controlled, of something that wasn't friendliness, recalculation, the look of a man who'd expected yes and received something he needed to report to someone higher up. "Sure thing," Boyd said easily. "No pressure at all. You've got my number if you change your mind." He handed her a card, looked at the cabin one more time, and walked back down the hill. His truck door closed with the expensive thunk of a vehicle that cost more than Raina's annual income. She watched him drive away. Then she wrote down his license plate number. That evening, after Milo was asleep, Raina sat in the Civic with her phone and searched Ridgepoint Holdings, West Virginia. The company had a clean website, professional, vague, full of language about sustainable land management and community partnerships. But public property records told a different story. In the last 4 years, Ridgepoint had purchased 11 parcels in the surrounding 3 counties. Every single one was classified as rural unimproved land. Every single one had been acquired for under $10,000, and every single one sat on or adjacent to an old mining claim. Ridgepoint Holdings wasn't buying land. They were buying what was underneath it. And the one parcel they'd been watching most closely, the one they'd apparently been waiting years to pick up at auction, was the exact parcel that a single mother with no degree and an empty bank account had purchased for $300 before they could get to it. Boyd Harmon would be back. Raina was certain of that. And the next time, the smile would be smaller and the numbers would be bigger, and the space between the offer and the threat would start closing like a door on a hinge. She needed to find out exactly what Eldon Harrow had discovered in these hills before anyone else figured out that she was looking. Milo found it on a Thursday. Raina would remember that later, not the date, not the time, but the day of the week, because ordinary discoveries happen on Saturdays and Sundays when people are looking for things, but the kind of discovery that changes the architecture of a life happens on a Thursday, when nobody is expecting anything at all. She was in the main room mapping the final row of wall carvings onto her notebook grid. The system was nearly complete now. She'd matched 80% of the symbols to coordinates on the mining claim map, but the last row of carvings near the floor didn't correspond to anything on the survey. They were different, smaller, more tightly spaced, as if they had been added later in a hurry by hands that were less steady than the ones that carved the rest. Milo was in the back room. The back room was the one Raina had finally opened 3 days after they arrived. Doors swollen shut from decades of humidity took a shoulder and a pry bar to move. Inside, a space roughly 12 by 10, emptier than the rest. No furniture, no debris, just a bare floor. But the floor was different. The main cabin had wide planks, 8 to 10 inches, rough cut, original to 1947. The backroom boards were narrower, 4 to 5 inches. They milled differently, arranged in a tighter grid, as if someone had pulled up the original floor and replaced it with different lumber for a specific purpose. Milo noticed what Raina's adult eyes had overlooked. He was on the floor doing homework. He preferred the back room because the afternoon light was less depressing than the kitchen, when his pencil rolled, half an inch, toward the wall, not away from it. The floor had a slight pitch. He followed it with his hand, pressing each board. Most were solid, but one near the east wall sat a fraction higher than its neighbors. Standing, you'd never notice. Lying on your stomach with your cheek against the wood, the way an 11-year-old does homework, it was obvious. "Mom," Milo called. His voice was calm, measured. The voice of a kid who'd learned not to overreact because overreacting wastes time. "This one moves." Raina came to the back room, knelt beside him, pressed the board. He was right. It had play, not from rot, from design. The board was shorter than the others, cut precisely to fit the space but not nailed at both ends. One end was secured. The other rested on a lip, like a drawer that had been pushed most of the way closed. She got the pry bar, worked the loose end carefully, applying even pressure, listening for the sound of the wood releasing. It took patience and several minutes of controlled effort, but the board finally lifted, revealing a narrow cavity beneath, roughly 18 inches deep, lined with what appeared to be tar paper to keep out moisture. Inside the cavity was a metal box, rectangular, about the size of a thick book, rusted along the edges but structurally intact, the kind of industrial lockbox that hardware stores sold in the 1950s and 1960s. A heavy combination lock hung from the front clasp, frozen with age but clearly functional beneath the corrosion. And across the top of the box, etched into the metal by the same hand that had carved the kitchen walls, was a sequence of symbols, the same circles, arrows, and crossed numbers that Raina had been decoding for weeks. Milo ran his fingers along the etched symbols. "Do you think it's cursed or something?" Raina looked at the box, looked at the carvings, looked at the systematic mind that had built a cabin, turned its walls into a coded map, replaced a floor to create a hidden compartment, and left a locked box beneath it with the cipher engraved on its own surface, knowing, trusting, that whoever found it would have already decoded the walls and would recognize the key. "If this is cursed," she said, "it's cursed with math." She didn't open it, not yet. She photographed the box from every angle, photographed the symbol sequence on the lid, and compared it to her notebook. The symbols used the same system as the wall carvings, but compressed, 5 clusters of 3 symbols each cluster representing a number, a 5-digit combination. They worked it together that evening by lantern light. Raina handled coordinate translations. Milo handled spatial relationships, angles and alignments, the symbols described in 3 dimensions. The boy had a gift for it, the same spatial intelligence Jesse had carried, the kind that never shows up on tests but builds things that last. By 9 p.m., Milo had a sequence, 731, 48, 16, 83. When he held up the notebook, "Mom, I think I have the combination." Raina looked at her son, 11 years old, sitting in a cabin that most of this county was afraid to enter, holding a notebook full of decoded coordinates, ready to open a box that had been sealed since before his father was born. She felt something shift in her chest, not fear, not hope, recognition. The recognition of a woman who was looking at the other half of her own mind, sitting across the table wearing a hoodie and sneakers. She made a decision. "Not tonight," she said. "But Mom, listen, we don't know what's in that box, but someone has been trying to get this property for years. A man drove up here and offered me $5,000 for a cabin everyone calls worthless. Whatever is in these hills is worth something. And the moment we show anyone what we found, we become a target instead of an accident." She tapped the notebook. "Right now, Boyd Harmon thinks I'm a broke single mother with no options. That's an advantage. The most dangerous person in any room is the one nobody is watching." Milo looked at her. He looked at the box through the doorway of the back room. He looked at the carvings covering the kitchen wall. And then he nodded, slowly, the way adults nod when they understand something that children usually don't. That power isn't about what you have. It's about when and how you let other people know you have it. "Okay," he said, "but we're opening it tomorrow, right?" "Tomorrow," Raina said, "after school." That night, lying in the car with the stars visible through the windshield, Raina ran the math one more time. A $300 cabin, carvings nobody had bothered to read. An 11-year-old who noticed a floorboard nobody else had touched, and a metal box that had been waiting 60 years for someone who understood the difference between treasure and leverage. Treasure is what you show people when you want them to celebrate. Leverage is what you keep hidden until you need them to cooperate. Tomorrow she would open the box, but tonight she would plan. Because the moment you discover what you're holding is never the moment that matters. The moment that matters is what you do before anyone else finds out. The combination worked on the first try. 731, 48, 16, 83. The lock resisted for a second, 60 years of rust fighting against 5 digits of precision, And then it gave. The clasp released with a sound like a bone cracking, and the lid of the metal box opened in Raina's hands while Milo stood beside her in the back room of the Harrow cabin, both of them holding their breath without realizing it. Inside was not gold, not cash, not jewels or coins or anything that a person finds in the kind of story where a lucky break fixes everything. What Raina found was better. What she found was a weapon. A leather folio, dark brown, cracked along the spine but intact. She opened it carefully on the kitchen table, and the contents spread across the wood like a hand of cards dealt by a dead man 60 years ago. First, a geological survey, a hand-drawn on drafting paper, dated 1963, mapped in the same precise hand that had carved the cabin walls. Topographic lines, core sample locations marked with red circles, depth measurements, mineral composition notations written in a shorthand that Raina cross-referenced against the wall carvings and decoded in under 10 minutes. Eldon Harrow had mapped the subsurface geology of 47 acres of Appalachian hillside with the accuracy of a trained geologist, using tools and techniques that most miners of his era wouldn't have known existed. The man had taught himself. That much was clear from the methodology. It wasn't textbook geology, it was practical geology, the kind a person develops by spending decades underground and paying attention to what the rock tells you when you stop looking for what you already expect to find. Second, 3 mineral assay reports from a private geological testing service in Charleston, dated 1964 and 1965. The reports were typed on letterhead that had yellowed but remained legible, and they confirmed what the survey suggested. The hills surrounding the cabin contained significant deposits of lithium, not coal, not iron, not the resources that Appalachian mining companies had been pulling from these mountains for a century. Lithium, an element that in 1965 was barely worth a footnote, used primarily in ceramics and pharmaceutical applications. An element that in the current decade had become one of the most strategically valuable minerals on Earth, essential for batteries, electronics, electric vehicles, and the renewable energy storage systems that entire nations were now racing to build. Third, a handwritten deed of mineral rights, 47 acres, signed by Eldon Harrow, witnessed by 2 names Raina didn't recognize, dated 1966, and, critically, never filed with the county. The deed existed. It was properly executed. But it had never been entered into the public record, which meant that as far as the county was concerned, the mineral rights to those 47 acres belonged to nobody. They were unclaimed, available, waiting to be registered by whoever held the documentation. Raina now held the documentation. Fourth, a letter. 1 page, handwritten on lined paper that had gone brown at the edges, addressed to whoever finds this. The handwriting was the same as the wall carvings, precise, steady, the hand of a man who treated every written word like a nail that needed to be driven straight. I am writing this because I am a miner who learned to read the ground before anyone taught me to read books. There is lithium in these hills, not coal, not iron, lithium. The companies don't know yet because they only test for what they already want. By the time they figure it out, this deed will make whoever holds it the owner of something they can't buy at auction. File it. Protect it. And don't let anyone tell you this land is worthless. The people who call things worthless are usually the ones trying to buy them cheap. Raina read the letter twice. She held it up to the lantern light and studied the paper, the ink, the certainty in every line. Eldon Harrow had written this knowing he might be dead before anyone read it. He'd written it anyway because the information mattered more than the messenger. Because a man who spends his life underground learns that what you leave behind is the only thing that lasts. Based on current lithium market valuations and regional geological assessments she'd researched at the library, the mineral rights Eldon Harrow had documented, conservatively accounting for extraction costs and market fluctuation, were worth somewhere between $8 and $15 million. She was sitting in a $300 cabin at a table she'd built from scrap lumber, holding a piece of paper worth more than every house in Briarton combined. Raina didn't celebrate. She didn't cry. She didn't call anyone. She photographed every document front and back, stored the originals back in the metal box, carried the box to a location she and Milo agreed on. Not in the cabin, not in the car, and somewhere on the property that only the two of them could find. Then, she drove to the post office and mailed a complete set of copies to her P.O. box. The difference between treasure and leverage is timing. Treasure is what you show people when you want them to celebrate. Leverage is what you keep hidden until you need them to cooperate. And Raina wasn't ready to cooperate with anyone yet. Not until she understood the full shape of the board she was playing on. That understanding came the next morning when she drove to the cabin at dawn and found fresh tire tracks on the access road. Deep treads. Recent. Heavy vehicle. Not a passenger car, something with weight and purpose. Someone had driven up during the night, turned around near the cabin, and left. But they hadn't just turned around. The tracks went directly to the rear of the building, the side closest to the back room, the side closest to where the floorboard compartment had been hidden for 6 decades. Whoever this was, they hadn't come to look at the cabin. They'd come to look at a specific part of it. Raina knelt beside the tracks and photographed them, measured the tread width with a tape measure, noted the pattern, commercial grade, the kind of tire that comes on trucks used for field work, geological surveying, site assessment, not a teenager's dare, not a curious neighbor, someone professional, someone who knew exactly where to look and came after dark to avoid being seen. Someone else knew about the box, or suspected. And they'd come while Raina and Milo were sleeping at the Briarton Motor Lodge, the first real beds they'd had since leaving the duplex. The game had changed. Raina wasn't the only one working on Eldon Harrow's puzzle. She was racing against someone who'd been at it longer and had resources she couldn't match. The question was no longer what was in the box. The question was who else wanted it, and how close they'd already come to finding it first. The custody petition arrived on a Monday, served by a process server who knocked on the cabin door at 7:15 a.m. while Raina was making Milo's lunch for school. The document was 11 pages long, filed by Whitaker, Dane, and Associates on behalf of Dale and Verna Keller, and it asked the Braxton County Family Court to grant temporary custody of Milo Keller to his paternal grandparents on the grounds of, Raina read the language slowly, letting each word register, unstable and inadequate living conditions, absence of permanent suitable housing, insufficient financial resources to provide for the health, safety, and welfare of a minor child, and the demonstrated inability of the respondent mother to maintain a standard of care consistent with the child's developmental needs. Every word chosen with surgical precision, every phrase designed to make Raina sound exactly like the kind of mother a court removes children from. Not dangerous, just failing. Not abusive, just insufficient. The particular cruelty of people who destroy you with adjectives instead of fists. The hearing was set for 3 weeks out, 21 days to prove that a woman living in a cabin with no running water and a part-time discount store job was a fit mother for an 11-year-old boy. 21 days while Verna and Dale sat in their 4-bedroom house with its central heating and its finished basement and its 2-car garage, looking exactly like the kind of grandparents a judge hands a child to when the math doesn't add up. Raina set the petition on the kitchen table next to her coffee. She read it again. Then she opened her notebook and started writing a list. That same afternoon, Boyd Harmon appeared at the bottom of the access road for the second time. He wasn't smiling. His canvas jacket was the same. His truck was the same. But the performance of friendliness had been stripped down to its frame. The raw mechanics of a man who'd been told by his superiors to get a result and was running out of pleasant ways to ask. He stood at the property line, carefully, Raina noticed, not stepping onto her land, respecting the boundary with the precision of someone whose legal team had told him exactly where the line was, and called up the hill. "Mrs. Keller, I'd like to talk about adjusting our offer." His voice carried the controlled patience of a man who'd been told to try again by someone who didn't accept failure. 25,000. Cash, no conditions. He paused. Properties out here have a way of developing problems, code violations, environmental assessments, county inspections. A woman alone with a child might find it easier to take the money and start fresh somewhere with better infrastructure. Raina stood on the porch and looked down at him. She noted the phrasing. Not better schools or better opportunities. Infrastructure, the word of a company man reading from a script that had been edited by a legal department. I appreciate your concern, Mr. Harmon. I'll think about it. She went inside, closed the door, let him stand there for a full minute before she heard his truck door close and the engine start. Then she drove to town. Cora Phelps was at the records office, sorting deed transfers with the efficiency of a woman who could file documents in her sleep, and probably had. Raina laid her situation out in direct terms, not emotional ones. The cabin, the carvings, the mining claim, the unfiled deed, Ridgepoint's interest. Cora listened without interrupting. When Raina finished, Cora took off her reading glasses and set them on the counter with a deliberate click. You found Eldon's survey, Cora said. Not a question, a confirmation. I processed the original property records on that parcel in 1986, when the county moved everything to the new filing system. I saw the mining claim designation. I noticed there was no filed mineral deed attached to it. I thought about it for years, wondered if someone would eventually put the pieces together. She looked at Raina with the measuring eyes of a woman who'd watched this county's history get rewritten in filing cabinets for 4 decades. I never figured it would be someone from outside. Cora picked up her phone and dialed a number from memory. I'm calling Garrett Pace, retired mining attorney, lives over in Clay County. He's been fighting companies like Ridgepoint since before you were born. Lost his own family's land to one of their predecessors in 2019 and has been looking for a way to return the favor ever since. Garrett Pace answered on the second ring. 71 years old, voice like gravel in a coffee can. Cora explained the situation in 3 sentences. Garrett said, "Send her over tomorrow morning. Bring everything." That night, Raina sat on the cabin porch and listened to the valley settle into darkness, crickets, wind, the distant creek she still hadn't found. She held 2 documents on her lap, the custody petition in one hand, the unfiled mineral deed in the other. 2 pieces of paper, one designed to prove she was nothing, one that proved she held everything. Garrett called at 9 p.m. She'd sent him photographs of the documents by email. His voice on the phone was different now, tight, controlled. It was the way professionals sound when they found something they weren't expecting. Raina, don't file this deed yet, and don't tell another soul what you have. He paused. There's something about these mineral rights you need to understand before you move. Ridgepoint Holdings conducted unauthorized geological testing on this parcel within the last 18 months. I found the permit applications they filed with the state, applications for adjacent parcels that conveniently overlapped onto your land. They already know what's in those hills. They've already tested for it. On property they had no legal right to touch. Raina's hand tightened on the phone. They weren't watching the auction because they were curious, Garrett continued. They were watching because they've been running an acquisition strategy for 3 years, buying up surface rights on old mining claims so they can bury the mineral rights before anyone connects the paperwork. You bought the one piece they needed most, and now you're sitting on evidence that they've been trespassing on it. That's not just leverage, Raina. That's a loaded weapon. Raina looked at the dark hills surrounding the cabin. Somewhere beneath those hills, lithium deposits waited in the rock. Millions of dollars of value that a mining company had already confirmed, and a single mother had just inherited the legal right to control. She thanked Garrett and hung up. Then she sat in the silence for a long time, doing what she always did, running the math. Except now the math had more variables than she'd started with. And the answer it was pointing toward was bigger than a custody hearing, bigger than a buyout offer, and bigger than a retired attorney in Clay County. It was pointing toward a confrontation she would need to win on every front simultaneously. And she had exactly 21 days to prepare. Raina filed the mineral deed at 9:04 a.m. on a Wednesday, 17 days before the custody hearing. Cora processed it with steady hands, stamped it, entered it into the county system, and handed Raina the certified copy without ceremony. It's done, Cora said quietly. Those rights are yours on paper now, officially. Simultaneously, Garrett Pace filed a formal complaint with the West Virginia Geological and Economic Survey documenting Ridgepoint Holdings' unauthorized testing activity on Reina's property. The complaint included permit applications that showed deliberate boundary overlap, no satellite imagery. Garrett had obtained from a mining industry database showing equipment tracks and core sample disturbances on the Harrow parcel, and time-stamped photographs Reina had taken of the tire tracks on her access road. 2 documents filed on the same morning, one establishing ownership, one establishing trespass. Together they created a legal position that Garrett described with a thin smile. If they challenge your deed, the investigation into their trespassing gets triggered automatically. They can't attack you without exposing themselves. Reina spent the next 2 weeks preparing for the custody hearing with the same methodical precision she'd brought to decoding the wall carvings. She documented everything. The cabin had been cleaned, repaired, and made habitable. She'd cleared the chimney completely. She replaced the porch boards with lumber from the Briarton hardware store, sealed every window, installed a propane heater, and connected a water tank fed by the spring Milo had discovered 50 yards uphill. The county health inspector, a tired woman named Sheila Franks, who'd been doing inspections for 22 years, walked through the cabin and signed off on the living conditions with a note that read, "Structure is sound. Basic utilities functional. Property is clean and maintained. No safety concerns observed." Milo was enrolled at Briarton Elementary with perfect attendance. His teachers submitted written statements confirming he was attentive, well-prepared, and socially engaged. His guidance counselor added that Milo demonstrates above-average problem-solving abilities and a strong bond with his mother, who is actively involved in his education. Reina had employment. 2 jobs now, the discount store night shift and a morning shift at May's Hardware in town, where the owner had hired her after watching her correctly identify a load-bearing beam in a renovation project he'd been overthinking for a month. She had property, she had income, she had a fixed address, she had documentation of stable housing, school enrollment, and community engagement. She was not the woman Verna's petition described. She was the woman Verna had never bothered to actually look at. Cora provided a written statement for the court confirming the property's legal status and current tax standing. Garrett provided a separate statement on the mineral rights filing and the property's assessed value, which, with the registered deed, it had jumped from the county's default $300 assessment to a preliminary mineral rights valuation that Garrett's independent geologist estimated at $9.2 million. The custody hearing was held in Judge Marion Tate's courtroom on a Thursday afternoon. Reina wore clean clothes, not expensive ones. She carried a folder, not a briefcase. She sat with her court-appointed advocate, a young woman named Dana Prescott, who'd been practicing family law for 3 years and had spent the previous week reviewing Reina's documentation with increasing confidence. Verna and Dale arrived with their attorney, a man named Clifford Braun from the same firm that had sent the eviction letter. Braun presented the petition's case: unstable conditions, no permanent housing, insufficient resources. He described the cabin as a condemned structure in a remote area with no utilities, and Reina's financial situation as precarious at best. Dana stood. She presented the health inspection report, the school enrollment records, the teacher statements, the employment documentation, the property deed, and then she presented the mineral rights filing and the independent geological assessment. Judge Tate looked at the valuation number. She looked at Verna. She looked at Dale. She looked at Clifford Braun, who had gone very still. "Mrs. Keller," Judge Tate said, addressing Verna directly, "when you filed this petition, were you aware that your daughter-in-law owns property with registered mineral rights valued in excess of $9 million? Verna's face lost its color, the way a screen loses its picture when the power cuts. Not gradually, all at once. Dale's hand moved to her arm, not supportive, restraining. The gesture of a man who knows his wife is about to say something that will make everything worse. "That assessment that can't be accurate," Verna managed. "She bought a shack for $300. She works at a discount store." She also owns mineral rights that were properly filed with this county 3 weeks ago, Judge Tate said evenly, which means the respondent is, on paper, the wealthiest property owner in this courtroom, including your clients, Mr. Braun. The judge dismissed the custody petition. She noted in the record that filing petitions based on outdated or inadequate information about a respondent's circumstances raises concerns about the motivations behind the filing, and that the court takes a dim view of custody actions that appear designed to exploit a grieving family member's temporary vulnerability rather than protect a child's genuine welfare. She looked at Verna when she said this. Verna looked at the table. Verna Keller had spent her entire life believing that authority came from being the person with the most paperwork. She had never considered the possibility that someone with better paperwork might walk into the room, sit down across from her, and dismantle her case in 15 minutes while wearing clothes from a discount store. Dale stood first. Verna followed. They walked out of the courtroom without looking at Raina, without looking at Milo, without looking at each other. Clifford Braun followed 6 paces behind with the expression of a lawyer who'd billed 40 hours on a case that had just collapsed like a wet paper bag. Outside the courthouse, Milo sat on a bench reading a library book about geology, a coincidence that would have been poetic if it hadn't been entirely practical, since the boy had become genuinely fascinated by rocks since decoding his mother's cabin walls. Raina sat beside him. The sun was warm. The air smelled like cut grass from the courthouse lawn. For exactly 90 seconds, she allowed herself to feel something that wasn't calculation. Relief, gratitude, the particular satisfaction of a woman who has been told she isn't enough and has just proven, in a court of law, that she is more than anyone estimated. Then her phone rang. Unlisted number. Mrs. Keller, a woman's voice, calm, professional, expensive. My name is Diane Caldwell. I'm the managing director of Ridgepoint Holdings. I understand you've recently filed mineral rights on a parcel we have considerable interest in. I'd like to meet, because there are aspects of this situation that I think you'll find time-sensitive. Raina looked at Milo sitting on the courthouse bench, reading a library book, unaware that his mother had just won the first battle and was now being invited to the last one. She looked at the courthouse doors closing behind Verna and Dale. She looked at the sky above Briarton, clear, blue, indifferent. Name the time and place, Raina said. The conference room at the Mountain Laurel Hotel smelled like leather furniture and ambition. Diane Caldwell sat at the head of a long table flanked by 2 attorneys in suits that cost more than Raina's car and Boyd Harmon in his usual canvas jacket, looking significantly less comfortable than the last time Raina had seen him. A water pitcher, glass cups, legal pads, the entire setup designed to communicate one thing: scale. We are large. You are small. Be reasonable. Raina arrived with Garrett Pace, who wore a flannel shirt, reading glasses, and the particular calm of a 71-year-old man who had stopped being impressed by conference rooms approximately 40 years ago. She carried one folder, no briefcase, no entourage, no performance. Diane opened with courtesy, professional, measured. The tone of a woman who ran meetings the way surgeons run operations, every word placed with purpose. Mrs. Keller, I appreciate you taking the time. Ridgepoint has significant investment in this region, and we believe there's an opportunity for a mutually beneficial arrangement. She slid a document across the table. $500,000 for full transfer of mineral rights. It's a generous offer, given the costs of extraction and the uncertainty of lithium markets. Raina didn't touch the document. She opened her folder instead. Ms. Caldwell, I have a question before we discuss numbers. Her voice was level, unhurried, the voice of a woman who'd rehearsed nothing because she didn't need to. She'd been running this conversation in her head for 3 weeks. Can you explain why Ridgepoint Holdings filed geological survey permits on parcels adjacent to my property with boundary coordinates that extended onto my land, and conducted core sampling on acreage you had no legal right to test? The room shifted. Not visually, atmospherically. Boyd Harmon's jaw tightened. One of the attorneys reached for his legal pad. Diane's expression didn't change, but her posture did. A millimeter of adjustment that told Raina everything she needed to know. They hadn't expected her to have this. Raina spread the evidence across the table. permit applications with highlighted boundary overlaps, satellite imagery showing equipment tracks crossing onto her parcel, photographs of the tire tracks on her access road with dates and GPS coordinates. The core sample disturbance patterns documented by Garrett's independent geologist and cross-referenced with the permits Ridgepoint had filed with the state. Each document was labeled, dated, and organized in the order that told the most damaging story, not randomly, but deliberately, the way a prosecutor builds a case, one piece of evidence at a time, each one making the next one heavier. Your company tested my land without authorization, Reyna said, which means you already know what those hills contain. You've known for at least 18 months, and you've been acquiring surrounding parcels to control the extraction zone while waiting for the Harrow property to come to auction so you could buy the surface rights and bury the mineral claim before anyone connected it to the subsurface resources. She paused. I let the silence do the work a lesser person would have filled with volume. I bought it first. Diane studied the documents with the controlled attention of a woman who understands that reacting too quickly is the same as confessing. She turned each page, read each annotation. The two attorneys beside her exchanged a glance that contained an entire conversation about liability exposure. Boyd Harmon stared at the table as if hoping it would open up and swallow him. What are you proposing, Mrs. Keller? I'm not selling the mineral rights. Not for $500,000, not for $5 million. The rights stay in my name. Reyna laid a single typed page on the table, terms she and Garrett had drafted in his kitchen at 6 a.m. that morning. I'm proposing a licensing agreement. For Ridgepoint can extract under strict environmental conditions that I approve. I retain full ownership, 12% royalty on all extracted minerals, and a community impact fund of $200,000 annually, directed to Briarton's school system, road maintenance, and housing assistance programs. Boyd Harmon leaned forward. That's absurd. You're a woman who bought a cabin for $300. You don't have the standing to dictate terms to a company with... Mr. Harmon. Reyna cut him off without raising her voice. The interruption was more effective than shouting would have been. A scalpel instead of a hammer. I have a filed deed, a documented claim, evidence of your company's trespassing, a retired mining attorney who has been building cases against extractive companies in this state for 4 decades. Payer. And a journalist from the Appalachian Independent who has been investigating land acquisition patterns in this county for 2 years. And would very much like to know why Ridgepoint has purchased 11 parcels on old mining claims while telling the county they're interested in conservation. She let that settle. Then she delivered the final piece. Your Q3 investor report is due in 6 weeks. 3 of your pending acquisitions in neighboring counties depend on clean compliance records. A state investigation into unauthorized geological testing would not only delay those acquisitions, it would appear in public filings that your investors and your board would find extremely uncomfortable. Reyna folded her hands on the table. So let's discuss standing, Mr. Harmon. Because from where I'm sitting, I have quite a lot of it. The room was silent. Boyd looked at Diane. Diane looked at the documents spread across the table. She looked at the licensing terms. She looked at Reyna. Diane Caldwell picked up the contract she'd slid across the table at the beginning of the meeting, the $500,000 buyout offer, and tore it in half, cleanly, deliberately. The sound of expensive paper separating was the loudest thing in the room. Draft new term, she told her attorney, Mrs. Keller's terms. Garrett Pace, sitting beside Reyna, didn't smile. He simply closed his reading glasses and put them in his shirt pocket. The gesture of a man who'd been waiting a very long time to watch a company like Ridgepoint sit down at a table they didn't control and discover that the person on the other side had done more homework than their entire legal department. They came expecting a transaction. Reyna gave them an education, and the lesson was one that every person in that room would carry for the rest of their careers. Don't confuse quiet for weak. Don't confuse poor for ignorant. And never, under any circumstances, assume that the person with the least money has the least information. Because information doesn't care who holds it. It only cares whether the person holding it knows what to do with it. As they walked through the hotel lobby toward the parking lot, Garrett said quietly, they'll look for ways around this. They always do. Companies like Ridgepoint don't lose gracefully. They lose slowly, and they look for cracks in the foundation while they're doing it. Raina nodded. I know. That's why I'm not finished. What she'd set in motion 3 days before this meeting, the final piece, the one no one at that table knew about yet, would be the move that sealed everything permanently. And by the time Ridgepoint discovered it, the board would already be closed. 3 days before the Ridgepoint meeting, Raina had driven 2 hours to the offices of the Appalachian Land Conservancy in Charleston. She'd met with their director, a woman named Helen Marsh, who wore hiking boots under her desk and had spent 20 years protecting mountain land from corporate extraction. Raina presented the geological survey, the mineral deed, and the conservation value of 47 acres of uncut Appalachian forest sitting above one of the most significant lithium deposits in the eastern United States. She filed a conservation easement, permanent, irrevocable. The easement restricted all surface disturbance on the property while allowing subsurface mineral extraction only under environmental protocols approved by both the landowner and the conservancy. It meant that even if Ridgepoint eventually found a legal angle to renegotiate the licensing terms, even if they outlasted Raina in court, outspent her, outweighted her, they could never alter the land use, never clear-cut the forest, never strip-mine the hillside, never turn the Harrow property into the kind of industrial scar that dotted every other ridge in the county. The easement was filed, recorded, permanent. Raina hadn't just won the negotiation, she had closed the board and removed the pieces. The licensing agreement was signed 4 weeks later in Garrett Pace's kitchen, witnessed by Cora Phelps and notarized by a mobile notary who'd driven out from Charleston for the occasion. Ridgepoint agreed to every term, 12% royalty, environmental protocols, the community fund. First-year projections estimated $1.4 million in royalties to Raina and $200,000 directed to Briarton, the school, the roads, the housing program, the library that hadn't been able to afford new books in 6 years. Verna and Dale heard about the mineral rights. They heard about the deal. They processed the information the way people process earthquakes. First disbelief, then recalculation, then the desperate scramble for higher ground. Dale called Raina's phone, not to apologize, because people like Dale don't apologize, they renegotiate. He suggested that since Jesse had been married to Raina when the cabin was purchased, the marital estate might have a claim to the mineral rights. Garrett handled the response in a 1-page letter that read, in its essential legal argument, the cabin was purchased with Raina's separate funds after Jesse's death. The deed was in her name alone. The mineral rights derived from an unfiled claim predating any Keller family connection by 30 years. There was no marital claim. There was no estate claim. There was no claim of any kind. The letter ended with a sentence Garrett clearly enjoyed writing. Any further communications from your clients regarding Mrs. Keller's property should be directed to this office, where they will be reviewed with the attention they deserve, Verna called once. Her voice was tight, controlled, straining against the edges of its practiced composure. You've done well for yourself, Raina. Jesse would have been confused by all this. Jesse would have been proud, Raina said. He just never got the chance to see what I could do without someone else's name on the paperwork. She ended the call. It was the last time she spoke to either of them. 6 months later, the cabin looked nothing like the building Raina and Milo had driven up to on that first afternoon. The chimney was rebuilt with local fieldstone. The porch was level and solid, built with timber from a mill in the next county that Raina had negotiated a bulk discount with by offering to recommend them to every renovation project the community fund would sponsor. The windows were clear glass. The front door hung straight. The carvings remained on the kitchen wall, preserved under 3 coats of marine lacquer, not as decoration, but as documentation. A record of the mind that built this place and the mind that finally read it. Inside, the cabin was warm. The wood stove worked. The kitchen had running water from the spring-fed tank, a propane stove, and a refrigerator that hummed quietly in the corner. Milo's homework was spread across the kitchen table, the same table where they'd decoded a 5-digit combination by lantern light, the same table where Raina had first read Eldon Harrow's letter and understood that a dead miner from 1971 had handed her the keys to a future he couldn't have imagined. Milo hung a photograph on the kitchen wall next to the carvings. His father, Jesse, taken the year before he died, smiling at the camera with Milo on his shoulders. Not because Jesse had earned credit for any of this. He hadn't. Jesse's failure to protect Raina on paper was the reason she'd ended up in the duplex doorway with a certified letter in 30 days. But Milo deserved to remember where he came from, even as he lived in what his mother had built. Raina sat at that table on a Tuesday evening, the same kind of ordinary weeknight when nothing important is supposed to happen. Milo sat across from her doing math homework. The cabin was warm. The walls held their coded secrets in plain sight. Through the window, the hills rolled away into evening fog, their surfaces green and unchanged, their interiors holding minerals worth millions, minerals that belonged to a woman who'd bought a condemned cabin for $300 because she'd understood something every other person in the room had missed. The most dangerous person in any negotiation is the one nobody takes seriously until it's too late. This is the truth Raina Keller's story teaches. The world is full of people who will look at what you don't have and tell you what you can't do. They'll count your money, measure your address, and decide you don't have the standing to sit at their table. They'll use paperwork to take your home and adjectives to take your child, and they'll do it with polite voices because cruelty wrapped in procedure is still the most common weapon in the country. But standing isn't something someone gives you. Standing is what you build when you stop asking permission and start reading the room. It's the information you gather when everyone assumes you're too tired or too broke to pay attention. It's the $300 investment that everyone laughed at until it was worth $9 million. And it's the quiet decision, the one nobody sees you make, to be the person who solves the problem instead of the person who waits for rescue. You are not too broke. You are not too alone. You are exactly as dangerous as the information you're willing to gather and the patience you're willing to exercise. Raina Keller taught this story that lesson. Now it belongs to you. If this story made you sit up straighter, hit subscribe and turn on notifications right now. The next story on this channel will challenge everything you think you know about who holds the power, and I need you here for it. Share this with someone who's been told they don't have the standing. Share it with someone fighting a battle nobody sees, because sometimes the thing that changes everything isn't money or luck. It's one person who refuses to stop reading until they find the answer. Drop a comment and tell me, what's one time someone underestimated you and lived to regret it? Your story might inspire someone else to keep going. I'll see you in the next one.